So this is going to be a somewhat a longer video, but I'm going to explain my long arc of political philosophical development from left-wing activist to right-wing nomad expat. So to give you a bit of a spoiler here, basically I thought I knew America. I was very far left. In university, I thought I knew everything, obsessed with concepts like justice and equality, and I championed third world liberation. Then I moved to the third world. I spent 8 years in Vietnam, a socialist country nominally with a one party state. And then I also spent time in places like Thailand and Mexico and Taiwan. And over the course of this, I slowly drifted towards the right. So now I more or less support nationalism, just as a blanket sort of thing. I think democracy is pretty fake, you know, and I'm more or less in a sort of cultural limbo where I have nostalgia for a West that simply does not exist, and a West that's drowning in its own waste. And I also believe that, even though I consider myself culturally Western, I think most Westerners are ridiculously paused and, you know, themselves a symptom of a culture in decline. So let's just go into this. My old view, I was very, like I said, very far left wing. I thought America was this grand oppressor. I was very over socialized. I bought into the lie of equality, and I was upset when I learned that the world is in fact not an equal place. If you've ever read Uncle Ted, he pretty much summed me up perfectly. Very resentful, very over socialized. Rather than accept the fact that reality is simply hierarchical, I sought to fight oppression. So I was about as far left as you could be. I was like into Maoism, literally Maoism. I thought countries like the USSR and Cuba simply weren't left wing enough, and that was the problem. Now, looking back, this is absolutely stupid. But just to give you an idea of how far left wing I was, I somewhere like probably in my in storage have a signed copy of the manifesto of the Weather Underground. I actually had Bill Ayers sign a copy of this thing that he wrote in the '60s. I had dinner with Chesa Boudin, the former DA of San Francisco, the disgraced former DA, and this is before he was a DA, of course. But that just gives you an idea of how far left wing I was. I was a organizer on campus. I'd organize protests at events, protesting. I was so far left wing, I was protesting the DNC, if that gives you an idea. I wasn't a big fan of Obama because, again, not left wing enough. I was like Hassan Piker on steroids, essentially, protesting against Columbus Day, this sort of stuff. So very, very far left wing. Nonetheless, I was starting to see cracks in this worldview. The left can be extremely cultish as a feature, not a bug. It's highly sectarian. When you're on the outside looking in, you think the left wing is this kind of monolithic thing. Internal to it, it's quite fractious. These people love to fight amongst each other. There's even jokes about it. But whenever you're within the left, uh, it's a very sort of fractious environment. People are constantly trying to one up one another, and that's one of the reasons why the left is so miserable and dangerous. Is because it's this kind of purity spiraling where everybody's trying to one up each other to see how morally pure they can be. Like I said, there's a lot of moral grandstandings, but another sort of crack I saw in the worldview was just the improbability of success. These are people who are deeply plagued by their own mental health issues, their own competency issues, yet who somewhat narcissistically believe that they are capable of managing the world, right? And I would see this in my own life. I'm like, wow, these people that I'm hanging out with, they can't even keep their, kitchen clean, yet they think they would somehow be qualified to, manage a centrally planned economy. Simply, on the face of it is pretty ridiculous. So, eventually I decided to move to Vietnam. As the adage goes, if you love it or leave it. So I was like, I'll try to leave it. I'll see what it's like out in the world. So why I went to Vietnam? Very culturally unique compared to my previous experience. I'd always had friends from other countries, Russia, Mexico, Europe. So I figured if I moved to South America, it'd just be like living in the United States, right? There's plenty of people from South America in the United States. I wanted something a little bit different. So I figured Vietnam was about as culturally different as you could get from the United States. Literally the opposite side of the world. It's nominally socialist. I thought I could learn something from what they were doing there. And I figured the language was a bit easier to learn than Chinese, right? At least you have the same sort of Latin letters. Um, and and in any case, my first impression of Vietnam as I was arriving, you land in Hanoi. The airport's about 20, 30 kilometers away from the city center. And the first thing I noticed was advertisements. I was like, wow, that's kind of unusual. I thought this was like a socialist country. Here they are advertising products. So it's far more capitalistic than I expected. It's a very interesting mix. And this is, 10, almost 15 years ago. But it's a very interesting mix of commercialism and state-sponsored nationalism. So you'd have advertisements for washing machines or something like that next to a somewhat gaudy socialist propaganda poster. Other than that, it's a very chaotic place. Um, Interestingly, in their desire to maintain control over the population, one party state, they kind of overlook a lot of stuff. At least they did 15 years ago, whenever they were less capable. So it's like they'll overlook burning trash by the side of the road and people running red lights because they'd rather just focus on maintaining political control. Kind of like that, actually. It's actually a very vibrant place as well. People are highly entrepreneurial, highly motivated, and people are exceptionally friendly. I ran into zero animosity towards the United States. Now, whenever I went there, I was like, "Oh, people must will probably hate me because I'm from the United States." And we spent, the better part of a decade turning their country into rubble. So I figured people would probably have a chip on their shoulder about that. Not the case at all. People are actually very xenophilic in a way. They really admire the rest of the world, especially the West. Um, so whenever I got there, a lot of my certainty about the way that things would be started to break down simply because the evidence was in front of my eyes. Here was this society that was much more capitalistic than I expected, with zero animosity towards the United States. Um, yeah, so it was quite the culture shock looking back. Now, I'm a pretty resilient, adaptable person. I didn't really experience culture shock in the moment, but now looking back, yeah, I was pretty taken aback by it. Some of the first big lessons that I learned there was this paradox of wealth. Now, I was pretty aware that the United States, though it was rich by comparison to Vietnam, was afflicted by a sort of spiritual poverty, kind of had this kind of cultural malaise. But this general principle was driven home further during a volunteer mission I did within the first few months I was there. I essentially went to a village in this mountain region, took them some school supplies, and I was struck by how happy everybody looked. And you almost had this tiered system where the person from the West, was by far the most morose, somber sort of person on the whole trip. Then you had the kind of urbanite intellectual students who were kind of mid tiered happiness. And then you had these people living in dirt walled huts, essentially, who, by all appearances, I mean, obviously they were getting free stuff from us, but you could just tell by the way their wrinkles developed that they smiled all the time, which was really striking to me. And this really drove home the point that suffering isn't a, doesn't derive from a state of being. Rather, it comes from comparison oftentimes. Like, we don't really notice the state of something. Instead, we notice the way things change and the state of something relative to something else. So that was the first big point, big thing that I noticed. I also started to appreciate nationalism more. So within the left, they often excuse nationalism of the oppressed. It's like, oh, they waved the Palestine flag and all of this. But the reality is Vietnam has been independent for 50 years, right? They're not oppressed by anybody, like at least nobody outside of their country. Um, so, but they are a highly nationalistic country. If you've never seen so much nationalism as you've seen in Vietnam, flags everywhere, everywhere, state sponsored nationalism. And this is used in a way cynically to quelch dissent, right? They can paint opponents, political opponents, as acting contrary to national interests, and this is done quite a bit. But there's also a very positive aspect in that it creates a sort of shared identity, shared community, and gives people something larger than themselves to latch onto. So again, nationalism in Vietnam is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Um, and it's again far more nationalist than any single Western country. There's no Western country that is more nationalist than Vietnam. It simply doesn't exist. So I started kind of really uh, appreciating this sort of nationalism and also looking down on the kind of cuckish mentality of people like Germans who despise nationalism. I also started to realize democracy was a bit of a fetter. The political system in Vietnam, it's basically a one party state. Elections are held, but election campaigns are not. So you're basically just people vote on whoever has the prettiest name, sort of thing. And they have a Congress. It acts like a rubber stamp for policies that have been decided in the backroom committees, but this is surprisingly efficient. Now, compared to the United States, you don't have people arguing about politics, right? The United States, every 4 years, people start hating their family members because they're, voting the wrong way. You have none of that in Vietnam. Zero time, energy, or resources is spent on fractious political campaigns. Um, Public opinion still shapes policy. If the government does something that upsets too many people, they'll usually scrap the policy back down and they'll try to do it again in 10 years. Um, so criticizing the government too loudly is not a wise idea in Vietnam. Anti-state activities are prosecutable. Like there's very few protests in Vietnam. It's very seen as very suspect. So you simply don't have people who are burning the flag of Vietnam. They would instantly be put in prison. Um, so but it works. You don't have that much crime in Vietnam. You do. You have petty crime. You have the underside, so to speak. But you don't have the feralness of the United States and the West. You don't have, uh, infinity immigrants, and that's what I want to talk about here. Is compared to the West, the democracy in the West, you must ask yourself who voted for infinity immigrants, who voted for infinity subsidies to Israel, who voted for retarded gay shit in everything. In Vietnam, you get a tolerance of diversity. You don't get it shoved down your throat. You don't get the valorization of diversity. So that's an interesting distinction. Now, another thing that I started to change my opinion in Vietnam was realizing that feminism is kind of a lie. It will keep you single. Now, whenever I first moved to Vietnam, I didn't want to be that guy. So I had a lot of moral hangups, and I didn't want to take advantage of local girls. But eventually I realized, well, I'm here. I should be, experiencing things and having a little bit of fun. I shouldn't be too lame. And I shouldn't be restricting myself over these kind of moral pretensions that I had developed, a decade earlier. So I started, dating around a bit. And through experience, I learned that basically everything that feminism teaches you will keep you dry dicked. Women like confident guys who don't shower them with attention. Um, Women are not angels. They're not these helpless creatures who can't decide anything for themselves. They tend to be sluts for the right guy while making other guys wait. There's a um, very dual mating strategy at play with a lot of women, and they love dominance. Like women, a lot of not everyone, but a lot of women love to be dominated. So that's just something I grew to discover through my experience in Vietnam. And again, it flew in the face of everything I thought I knew about women and feminism. Now, I started to also get a wider view of history while I was in Vietnam. I came to realize that conquest, imperialism, these sorts of things, these are not exceptions. This is not just something the West does, makes them uniquely evil. Instead, conquest is the norm. Yeah, every single person or every single group of people around the world has either colonized other people or spent their entire history being colonized themselves. And this occurs within Vietnam as well. Vietnam is this long country which got that way by people from one area moving down the coast and taking over the rest of the country. There's entire civilizations that were driven out of parts of Vietnam. The Cham people in central Vietnam, whose relics are still around, Mi Sun, that sort of thing. These are people who were effectively Hindu, and they were driven out by the King Viet from the north, and they ended up fleeing to Cambodia. So expansion and conquest are vital for evolution. Like, if we weren't an expansionary species, then we'd still be eking out a miserable existence in some rift valley in Africa somewhere. Societies either conquer or get conquered. The West was just very good at it in recent history. So I started taking this wider view of history, understanding just the way things are without necessarily attaching too much value to it. As I did this, I started reappraising some of the positives of Western culture. So I more or less started noticing a bit of the differences between the West and the East. In Asian countries, they really value harmony, conformity, indirectness. They're very conflict avoidant. They care a lot about their reputation. They're like saving face, and they care about group cohesion a lot. You also have to read between the lines a lot in Asian countries because people are extremely indirect. Essentially, Asian cultures developed from paddy culture. You had these small villages that grew rice, and in order to grow rice, you cannot do this as like a single family. You need the whole community to pitch in, to manage water levels, to engage in group harvest, this sort of thing. So you had societies and cultures that developed that really prioritized communalism and harmony. The West, on the other hand, is very individualistic. People valorize self reliance, directness, standing out, speaking your mind, and making yourself understood. And of course, this has changed over time, as kind of feminism has taken over in the West, and as we've imported foreign cultures, this has definitely changed. But nonetheless, this sort of Western culture really grew from the Rocky Steppes and frontier culture, where people had to be a little bit more independent and you needed to rely on your neighbors not so much to help you, harvest, but you needed to be able to count on them to ensure they would help you if there was a conflict. If another tribe, another group came and tried to dominate you, would you be able to rely on your neighbors to band together and fight that outside threat? So that's where a lot of Western culture comes from. Now, America in particular is extremely friendly compared to a lot of other countries. You say hello to strangers, there's a certain politeness that's expected. You get out of people's way, right? Like in Vietnam, you don't get out of people's way. There's absolutely zero responsibility for you to get out of somebody else's way. If the elevator opens, you just walk right in. It's just, or if the train door opens, you don't necessarily wait for people to come out before you go in. um, People take greater self-responsibility. There's less like reliance on other people. And there's this notion that you should pursue your dreams, this sort of stuff. It's a little bit less pragmatic in the West. People are more idealistic. But there's also some very negative aspects of Western culture. As it is at present, it's soft and lacking vital spirit. If you've ever heard of the character of the spoiled rich kid who never had to work for anything in their life, that basically describes the West writ large. There's a saying in the East that the family fortune is lost by the third generation. You get the first generation who are the empire building builders, the second generation maintains it, and the third generation loses it. That's kind of where we're at right now. In the West, there are lots of luxury beliefs and virtue signaling. This sort of beliefs that you can hold because you have been pampered and spoiled and supported your whole life. There's also a large degree of self hatred and apologizing for greatness. This sort of notion that you're supposed to atone for winning, which is absolutely foreign to most Eastern cultures. There's a lot of navel gazing, a lot of rumination on your own thoughts, beliefs, and ideas. And there's an over tolerance that's been leading to the decline of the West. This sort of idea that we have to babysit a bunch of 80 IQ um, feral NPCs, which somehow we're responsible for. And we have to funnel these resources in order to feed people who are somehow unable to of taking care of themselves, which is just a complete drain on society. Leads to larger crime rates, just a generally not fun place to be. But people in the modern West are also very hedonistic. There's this sort of mud dick mentality, where it's just partying and all this stuff. Low effort, low energy. This sort of just get along to get along. Nog culture, right? Hip hop culture. This sort of valorization of just being a degenerate